Gohan and Trunks had headed home after their dad had gone off to train. They had asked their moms if they could go with him. Well, Trunks had asked, and Gohan had just been standing next to him. But both of their parents and Kami had said no. Something about the place he was going to, being a place they shouldn't see for a long time. It bothered Trunks a lot, but Kami immediately put him back to work with Gohan sweeping the lookout. They were both waiting anxiously to start training. Gohan had told Trunks that Mr. Piccolo had offered to train him, but hadn't gone into much detail. A few days later, Chi-Chi had decided that Gohan and Trunks should be returning to school. They had already missed a lot of it. Even as Bulma protested that she could probably teach him better than any other school on this planet, Chi-Chi had been adamant that they have some social interaction other than the people on the lookout only. They had stayed there partly because without Goku around, the fear of them going down and not being able to defend themselves was too great, so they stayed. But Chi-Chi was then constantly nagging the kids to study, rather annoyingly dragging Bulma from her work on the Saiyan pod. She understood that they did need to study, but at their age, their focus could have been on simply being kids. Something Chi-Chi was not too focused on. She complained about Goku wanting to train them too much, but never about them studying too much either. During her adventures with Goku, she had learned that brains or brawn could only get you so far, which is why she and Goku had balanced each other out perfectly. She understood you needed both. It was a few days later in one of her lessons with Chi-Chi sitting in the back of the room watching the boys as she explained some maths on the board that Piccolo and Kami suddenly walked into the room. Bulma went silent as she stared at the serious expressions on their faces, but Chi-Chi was just irked that they thought it okay to just come and barge into Trunks and Gohan's classes. Trunks and Gohan were also surprised and looked up as Mr. Piccolo walked up to them before grabbing both of them by the back of their shirts and heading for the door. Chi-Chi was already fuming as she let out a barrage of complaints to the Namekian, but he just seemed to ignore them as he headed for the door. Bulma finally shook herself out of the surprise and rushed in front of the door with her arms spread out, blocking his path. "Piccolo, what's the big idea?" A small part of her was worried that Goku had been wrong about him and he was going to take the chance he was not around to do something, but she trusted his judgment. Well, sometimes, not all the time. He had his moments. Oh, Kami, she hoped this wasn't one of the wrong ones. "I'm doing the favor that Goku asked me, now get out of my way." "A favor Goku asked?" Bulma asked confusedly. "Yes, he asked me to look after his little brats while he was away. So it's time to start their training." Chi-Chi and Bulma were both confused. "What sort of training is this?" Chi-Chi asked. She already wanted Gohan and Trunks to get back to their lessons. The boys themselves were just watching the exchange between the adults quietly, not wanting to get into trouble with anyone as they shared a momentarily look of panic between the two of them. "None of your concern. Now, if you'll get out of my way." There was a finality to his statement as Bulma felt a presence behind her, and she suddenly remembered that Kami had come with him. She looked to him for any sort of answer, and the man stood stoic as ever before giving her a firm nod, which caused her to deflate. So she had to do this. She knew if she and Chi-Chi said no, they wouldn't force the decision, but she also knew that when Kami usually asked them to do something, there was always a reason. He was, after all, Goku's sensei, and if he said they should let Piccolo do it, then they should. She turned back to the shouting match that Chi-Chi was having alone with Piccolo, who only seemed to be getting more annoyed. "You can go with them." Chi-Chi abruptly stopped, turning to her. "Have you lost your mind too? Who knows what type of hellish training he would put the kids through? Plus, have you forgot? They need to study." Bulma just let out a sigh as she stepped to the side while Chi-Chi followed her, telling her how much of a bad idea this was. But while Chi-Chi was distracted, she signaled for the others to leave. Bulma kept up the argument till the others were gone, and she was sure they had flown off before she gave Chi-Chi a thumbs up and left the room headed to the Scion pod in what had become her lab on the lookout. It was then that Chi-Chi saw that the room was now empty before she let out a shrill rushing out of it, searching frantically for the two boys. She only found Mr. Popo calmly sweeping as he was whistling away. Meanwhile, some distance away, Piccolo was flying with one of the boys clutched in each hand, hanging loosely. Kami was following right behind him. He still wasn't sure of what his former half sought to do, but he was interested in finding out. Piccolo increased his speed as he decided to finally address the boys. He had flown fast in random patterns and told them to keep their eyes closed for a reason. "Hey, you two! Open your eyes!" The boys opened their eyes, glancing around, still shocked to be flying without Nimbus. They were hanging by a thread as Mr. Piccolo clutched them without a hint caution before lifting them up to meet his face. "Your training is rather simple. It's to survive." Both boys looked at him confusedly before he huffed in annoyance. "You both have lived lives of comfort, never wanting for anything, never struggling for anything. But your father struggled. I struggled. And only through struggle and through its conquest will we see if you are ready to take on your training." They saw the serious look on his face and turned to see Kami had something similar. Instead of a glare, there was a blank, stoic look. "You will survive in this forest alone. Only when I see you make it through will we see if you're worthy to train." The boys started panicking, causing a smirk to appear on Piccolo's face, which caused Trunks to glare at him. "Me and Gohan will beat your stupid challenge, you big meanie." At that, Piccolo's smirk grew further. "Who said you would survive together?" Trunks and Gohan froze. They couldn't do that, right? He couldn't do that? "Trunks, this is your stop." Before the boy could dispute what he was on about, Piccolo let him go, sending him falling to the ground as he fell for a while before he crashed through some branches before hitting the ground. He groaned as he got back up to his feet, nursing his bruises and scratches as he looked up at Mr. Piccolo, Kami, and Gohan before they blasted off into the sky. Piccolo made sure to fly in a confusing pattern rapidly to make sure Trunks couldn't follow before he headed to another direction. Gohan was screaming at the quick shifts in direction and speed. Piccolo needed to get further away from Trunks in order to ensure that the boys couldn't find each other to make this task easier. This was a test for them individually. It was a while later that Piccolo came to a stop above a small forested area before he unceremoniously chucked Gohan to the ground. The boy crashed with multiple thuds through the foliage, scratching himself up as he did before, falling with a heavy thud on the ground. He slowly got up and looked up, but Mr. Piccolo and Kami were already gone, and he was stuck in the forest alone, as he could hear howls and roars in the distance. He really hoped they would come back soon. Piccolo and Kami settled upon a mountain that separated the two boys on either side with a seemingly unattainable ascent without flying. "While your test seems to have the right intentions, are you sure those two will be safe?" Kami asked, but Piccolo just replied with a gruff as he looked on. Of course he was going to watch the boys, but he didn't want to interfere unless it was absolutely necessary. "This is the quickest way to get their fight or flight sorted right now. They weren't even able to defend themselves when Goku's brother came and could only be lugged around." He looked at the two already doing different things, while Gohan was being cautious and scouting his area while hiding. Trunks seemed to be charging blindly through the forest as if he thought they were watching, and he wanted to prove he didn't need this stupid test. "An understandable test. For how long do you think this test will go on? Trunks will need to start his training sometime." Piccolo looked at the two, varying different aspects separating them. "When they are ready." Kami nodded in agreement. He had first questioned this test, but it made sense for what it was setting out to do. The two boys under the protection of Goku, Bulma, and Chi-Chi hadn't really faced any troubles, while their parents had set out on many wild adventures that continually tested their strength and helped them grow, even the defeat of the Demon King. They both waited in silence, some distance away from each other, watching the boys, before Kami finally got up a while later. "I must return to my duties. Farewell." He flew away, making sure none of the boys could see him as he took one last glance at them and then at Piccolo, before flying off towards the lookout. When Kami landed, he immediately saw Chi-Chi rushing towards him, already shouting expletives that he didn't focus on as she looked a few seconds away from popping a vein. It took only a light tap of his staff on her head, and she was fast asleep, with him levitating her before she could hit the ground as he saw Mr. Popo come out of the building. "Has anything happened while I was away?" Mr. Popo just shook his head. Nothing to report as of now. However, Goku seems to be making rather timely progress on his journey. Kami nodded. He didn't think it was possible to go faster on Snake Way. The journey was treacherous, but if anyone could do it, with the power Goku had shown, it was very much possible. "Please take Chi-Chi to her quarters. I need to speak to Bulma." Mr. Popo nodded as he levitated Chi-Chi towards him. "She's in the observatory next to the 4th training room." Kami nodded as the two parted ways. He needed to know what she had garnered from that scion pod. He knew a lot about the scions, mostly from whispers by those who had survived them, but it was sometimes hard to separate facts from myth, and so much time had passed since he had isolated himself on this planet. He found Bulma busy sifting through a lot of data on many monitors as the scion pod was in the center of the room with various wires attached to it and partially destroyed scion armor on a table on the other side of the room. He tapped his staff on the ground twice to draw her attention without scaring her. "Oh, Kami. Need anything?" Bulma asked. The old man walked slowly to a chair and finally sat down. He wanted everyone to understand just what the scions were and who they served, and Bulma seemed the most logical and the one who would most likely understand the scale of the threat, and so he would begin with her. He took a deep breath and locked his eyes with her and began to retell his tale.